I was invited to write an article for a journal, Currents in Theology and Mission, on Mark for an issue that would come out this last fall, just focused specifically on the Gospel of Mark. And I was asked to write the lead article and sort of lay out the overview of this, which I agreed to do. And it occurred to me that it would be a good idea when Mark asked me to teach a course this winter at St. Andrew, if I focused on the Gospel of Mark. And hence, this course is really a reflection of that work, and indeed a reflection of that article. Now, I can tell you that this article is listed on St. Andrew's adult education website. And if you ever want to read it, you're welcome to, but this class is going to follow that article pretty closely. And I think that you will see, if you do read it, or if you are in this class, my approach to the Gospel of Mark. I also want to say, for those of you who may not be at St. Andrew and familiar with this, that if you can't make the Zoom session any given week, these are being recorded. And those of you at St. Andrew know, you simply go to the St. Andrew website and to the adult education page, and you can see the session from the week or weeks previous. So I encourage you to do that. Obviously, you're just watching it, and that's fine. I think it's also important for us to have a little bit of a conversation about format and interaction and so on and so forth. You're probably virtually all muted at this point, but if you want to say something, kind of wave your hand or whatever, and you can try to get my attention. And in that way, then I think I'm capable of unmuting you, and you can make your contribution. We will save some of this to later in the hour, so we just don't lose control and have chaos out here. We have enough chaos on our life the way it is. So we can try to manage this. And we'll see how that goes. If that doesn't go, we'll come up with doesn't go well, we'll come up with a different strategy. I would also, yes, Janet here, are you live? You're live?
I wanted to say that we can unmute ourselves.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure you wish for us to unmute ourselves.
No, that's perfectly all right. I can get so many things going, I can't keep track of it. So if you wave your hand and I call on you and just unmute yourself and say, I don't mind being interrupted at all, but at some points along the way, I may simply say questions, ideas, thoughts, whatever, and people can pipe in if they have something they'd like to say or ask or whatever the case may be. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes.
Okay. This doesn't really pertain to this first session, but I would appreciate it if beginning next week and sessions following, you would have a copy of the Bible available to you. Now, I'm going to be using, obviously, an English translation of the Bible, and I'm going to be using the New Revised Standard Version. You can use any edition you want, but any translation you want, but it works better if you have perhaps the same one as I am using, and that's the New Revised Standard Version. Obviously, other translations are going to be translated differently and worded in different ways. but it's easier. I will bring the Greek text to bear as it's appropriate or when there are things that I want to draw attention to, but that's not something most of you are going to read, and that's fine. And I would also like to say that as I show you the general outline for the 4 weeks, it will work better if you have read the section, basically divided into thirds, prior to the time we get together. And then you have some background and so on and so forth. So, and I will point that out, those sections out a little later here. Those of you who are experienced in these Zoom sessions, do you have any words of wisdom in terms of how we organize and structure this so that it benefits everybody and works well? I know Sharon and Dan Faco and the Bleasners and Peggy and most of you have been to other sessions. If you want to say anything or have any words of warning to me, I certainly welcome that. You're good? Seem reasonable? Okay, good. Now I am going to share the screen again with a little bit of background information. You see the title, The Gospel of Mark, a Narrative Theology, and then the description, which I have posted. I'm not going to go through that description at this moment, but just draw your attention to it. We'll come back to it a little later, because in that description, there's all kinds of information and nuances. Some of you may be familiar with, others of you less so. That's fine. This whole sheet is posted on St. Andrew's adult education website later on. And then again, this is kind of perhaps a formality, but it's still a formality that academic types want to often honor, and that is a bibliography. And I'm assuming you can all see this. I would just like to draw your attention to a couple of things. Some of these books have been around a long time, others not so long. A friend of mine, Charles Boberts, who teaches at St. John's University and Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, has recently written a book on the Gospel of Mark, a liturgical reading. He's Roman Catholic, and he has been very interested in the way that Mark's Gospel follows a liturgical reading. And he argues this case with great force, and it's been influential on my thinking about Mark, even though personally I think he overstates the case a bit. But he's trying to do this in many cases for Roman Catholics. And then a new book by Susan Hubenthal.
Mortgage is down below $1 million now.
Say again?
Below 900,000. The mortgage. Yeah, 900 million. 100.
Susan Hubenthal has published, it's been translated into English and it's come out recently, Reading Mark's Gospel as a Text from Collective Memory. It's a huge book. And for this class and for this article, for this class, because it wasn't even out when I wrote the article, but a text from collective memory. It is very insightful in terms of the way we think about the Gospels as community texts that are engaged in memory. I'm getting a little bit of static here somewhere from somewhere. Then you see this page. Today we're going to deal with introduction and preliminary matter.
We need Carol Hogan to
Yeah,
mute.
Carol Hogan, can you mute yourself? I'm trying to mute her. There we go. I think she muted herself. Okay, sorry.
Okay, good. Thanks, Robin. Uh, This session, we're dealing with some preliminary matters and introductory matters. But then on the 17th, you see, we're going to focus on Mark chapters 1 through 434, the beginning of the gospel and the beginning of the journey, so to speak, in the gospel. So that's the section that I would ask you to read prior to next Sunday. And then you look at the third line, January 24th, we're going to look at Mark 34 to 11:10, the reign of God. And then finally, on the last Sunday of January, Mark 11:11 to 16:8, to Jerusalem and beyond, who will speak. Now, you realize right away, and certainly those of you who are clergy realize, preachers and exegetes, we're going to have to be selective. We could run this course from today until the end of May and probably would not exhaust a fraction of the possibilities in Mark's gospel, but that's not our purpose here. Our purpose is to get an overarching look at the Gospel of Mark so that when we sit in the pews or we sit at home online, however, we are getting a sense of how these individual gospel readings from Mark fit into a larger narrative pattern and how we might see them in that literary context. Now, I also have here, and this is posted on the St. Andrew Adult Education website, a very helpful outline for the whole of the Gospel of Mark in Sandra Hubenthal's book. And I think you can see here, perhaps, the way in which at least parts of my threefold division for the 3 sessions follow parts of this outline. It's not perfect because she focuses on certain chapters of Mark in particular. But again, I think this might be helpful to you as you read Mark's gospel from beginning to end. And those of you who want to read the whole gospel in one sitting, Mark is short enough you can do that, unlike perhaps Matthew and Luke. So these are kind of introductory things that I think come into play and sort of give you a sense of how we're going to proceed. Those of you who have been in classes I have taught before realize my outline here is very brief. I have sometimes given out outlines that try the patience of everybody. But here, since we are working on a specific New Testament text, a gospel text, we're looking at these, looking at this Gospel of Mark, and it provides kind of the structure for most of what we're going to do. I hope that's clear, and I'm going to now try to get rid of this thing here and go back. Okay. See, welcome to others. I see Scott, I see Jennifer, and a whole variety of other people here. So that's kind of how we're going to move through this class. And then I'd like to share something else with you and have make a few comments about this. Some of you have seen at least the first page in this before. And those of you in Montana, we're going to see this as well. But the pandemic came and it preempted a course I was going to teach in Montana last spring. But for those of you who were at the class I taught last winter at St. Andrew, this image may come back to your attention. I operate in general terms with a conversation model of biblical interpretation, a conversation with biblical material. In this case, that biblical material is focused on the Gospel of Mark. Now, you see here, can you see my cursor and where it moves? Does that show up for you? Okay. Over here, we have the text, an ancient text. The Gospel of Mark comes from the 1st century of the Common Era. You and I, sitting here this morning, are interpreters, readers of that ancient text. In our modern context is at least about 2,000 years later than the writing of the Gospel of Mark. So you and I invariably come from our own context and encounter that ancient text. If we are sophisticated conversation partners, if we are sophisticated readers of those ancient texts also speak to us in our modern contexts. And I think somewhere in this blue oval, we are engaging, and the text is engaging us, we're engaging the text, and we come up with ways of interpreting and reading those texts. I have had over the years students say to me, let's just read the text. Yes. Active reading is also always an act of interpretation. And we're bringing two worlds together, an ancient world and a modern world, to make sense out of these foundational, historic, Christian texts and documents. That's true of the whole Bible, and it's clearly true when we turn to the Gospels in the New Testament. And so, in this class, I want to structure a particular conversation, and I want to make an assertion up front that the Gospel of Mark, among a variety of other things, is a narrative. It's a story. That's not to impugn the integrity of the gospel. It's to elevate the integrity and power of that gospel as a narrative, and we can engage it, interpret it, and read it as a narrative. And you will see how this plays itself out in some arguments I may want to make. Now, one of the, can you see this shared thing well enough to make sense out of it? Is that okay? Good. Moving along, one of the questions that often arises is, how should we think about the Gospels in general terms as literary texts? How should we think about the four Gospels and their relationships to one another? And I suspect if I were able to go around this group and poll how you generally think of the Gospels and their relationships to each other, at least some people, many people, we would have all sorts of different ideas. But one idea that might come up is that they're all, generally speaking, eyewitnesses to Jesus, his ministry, and so on and so forth. And that they all have their own perspective on the gospel. Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, they all have a different perspective. Obviously, John is very different than the other three. Well, biblical scholars and most of us who think about this kind of seriously over time don't think that's how they relate to each other. In fact, scholarship has shown for a long time that there are some peculiarities. And this diagram, which you see, is one of the fairly common ways of seeing the relationships between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, namely what we call the Synoptic Gospels. They can be read together and they are most alike. That leaves John to the side, the fourth gospel. Now, there are other ways of seeing these relationships. I simply give you this one as a kind of illustration of how they may be seen in relationship to each other. It does come to play in what we will be talking about later. It's generally thought that Mark's gospel is the earliest of the three, probably written in or near or shortly after 70 of the Common Era. Now, many of you know what is significant about that, because it is the year, 70 is the year when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans. That's historical fact. So Mark is emerging as a Jesus community document and narrative in that, probably in that kind of environment. Shortly before this has happened, shortly after it, it was a traumatic experience. If we are living through traumatic experiences today, the early Jesus followers and the Jews were living through traumatic experiences in Palestine at the time. Now, what has been observed is that almost all of Mark's gospel appears in Matthew and or Luke. Almost all of it. Mark is 16 chapters in length, Matthew is 28, Luke is 24, so they're considerably longer. But there is also some material that is found in Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. That has traditionally gone by the letter Q from a German word, Quelle, or source. And it is hypothesized that both Matthew and Luke are drawing on a second source that we don't have in our possession. Now, this may all seem arcane, and to you it may seem obtuse and so on and so forth. I just give this as an example for the basic notion that we think Matthew used Mark and wasn't written until between 80 and 90 of the Common Era. Likewise, Luke had access to Mark and perhaps some tradition called Q out here and was written between 80 and 90 as well. That means that the Gospels post-date by a half a century or so, 40, 50 years, Jesus' crucifixion. Why were they written down at that time? There are several reasons, but a couple that strike me as significant. Christ has not returned yet. And the eyewitnesses are dying off. And it doesn't appear that they don't know when Christ is going to return. And there is an impulse to preserve the stories and memories of Christ. Another one might be is that the church is spreading fairly significantly, and they need to stabilize the traditions about Jesus, the memories about Jesus. So we have two contexts when we think about the Gospels. Jesus' own context, his time, his ministry, his place in the world, and the churches in the last third of the first century that these gospel writers are writing to. I can pause here if you have any questions, or um, comments you'd like to make about this, you can unmute yourself and enter in if you want to. Again,
Jim. Oh, Jim.
yes, Janet. Janet.
Okay.
Okay, Mary.
Yeah. So I don't know. I've heard that there are other gospels out there that weren't canonized, like the Gospel of Peter or something. And I don't know how true that is, but how would they fit in with this?
Yeah. That's a very good question, Mary. The answer, are there other gospels out there? The answer is yes. Generally speaking, they post-date the New Testament Gospels, although they may have traditions that go right into the early part of the first century. Let me give you an example. There is a gospel has been preserved or found in the sands of Egypt, among a couple of other places, called the Gospel of Thomas. It is very much like the Q material in its style. The Q material, that material common to both Matthew and Luke, is teaching material. There is no birth account, there's no crucifixion, trial and crucifixion story in the Q material, and neither is there in the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter and these others. They're non-canonical gospels, but Jesus' teaching tradition may be deeply rooted in the traditions about Jesus from the first century, seen in Q and its relationship to Thomas, etc. Jesus for Q and Thomas is primarily a teacher. He's not the crucified Messiah. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is the crucified Messiah. Yes, he's a teacher too, but the story I don't think this is an overstatement to say that the story culminates in his trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. And those things have become formative for the early church and the later church's theology and view of the Messiah. There are other gospels that are what we would call Gnostic gospels. It's a brand of many brands of early Christianity that didn't come to be part of what we call normative Christianity. Is that helpful, Mary? Okay, good. Anybody else want to make a comment, Janet?
I'm remembering that the Gospel of John doesn't have any parables. Jesus doesn't teach in parables. And I'm remembering that the Gospel of John alternates between sermons delivered by Jesus and something else which I've forgotten.
Signs probably.
Oh.
Yeah, you're right. It does not have parables as we think of them in the Synoptic Gospels. It's a book of, it says explicitly, a book of signs. The order is different. It clearly has the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection and appearance of Christ. The language style is different. We also have these I am sayings. I am the true vine, etc. Very familiar to John's gospel. You are exactly right, Janet, about that these are these differences between the fourth gospel and the synoptics clearly set it apart. It may have been written between 90 and 100, or maybe even at the beginning of the 2nd century, John's gospel, that is. Larry?
Question, why are the gospels written in Greek and not Latin?
Okay. Well, maybe the question slightly refined.
Okay.
Why not Aramaic?
Okay.
Right.
Well, first of all, there's a basic consideration. According to conventional wisdom, Jesus was an Aramaic speaker. It's close. It's a Semitic language related to Hebrew. But by the time the first century comes around, most of the Jews in Palestine would have been Aramaic speakers. Now, the texts of the Old Testament are in Hebrew and so on and so forth. How much Hebrew the average Jew in Palestine would have known is a little unclear. So the vernacular for Jesus would have been Aramaic. So why not the Gospels being written in Aramaic? Well, many in the early church by this point were Greek speakers. And the early church was spreading into Greek-speaking lands as it spread around the eastern end of the Mediterranean on toward what we call Greece and Rome and so on and so forth. Now, it is the case that scholars earlier in the 20th century were kind of bent on trying to see if they could retranslate the Greek Gospel of Mark back into Aramaic. Those efforts were never very successful, I think. But you see a few expressions in the Gospel of Mark that are translated, which suggests that maybe from the Aramaic or whatever, even Hebrew, and you find them elsewhere as well. So, but what's the important point, and what's the important implication of your observation, Larry? By the time you and I read, even if we were reading Mark in Greek, by the time we get there, that tradition has already been translated from Aramaic into Greek. And again, a translation, whenever it occurs, is an interpretation. And so we come today with our English New Revised Standard Version translation, and we're reading a translation that has been constructed from all of the known Greek manuscripts about Mark. And if you wanted someday, when we can get face-to-face, look at my Greek New Testament, or Robin's Greek New Testament, or Karen's, or any Pastor Mark's, and look at the bottom, you will see an apparatus that gives us all the known Greek manuscripts on any given chapter and verse. And it's a reconstructed text in Greek that then the English translators use to translate into other languages.
So
Okay.
my question is, is there any physical evidence of Q, or is it all hypothetical?
Yes and no, Bev. It's a good question. We have never found, we've never discovered Q anywhere in the sands of Egypt or Palestine, or archaeologically. I couldn't show you a text of Q that was preserved in some storeroom or in the sands of the desert. So when we refer to Q, the only physical textual manifestation would basically be what's preserved in Matthew and Luke, and its similarities in some respects to the Gospel of Thomas. It's a hypothesis. Right. Now, other scholars may come up with a different hypothesis. This is sometimes called the two-source hypothesis. They have come up with different hypotheses about this. In fact, a person I was in graduate school with has come up with an entirely different way of thinking about the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and perhaps John in some sense. So, right, it's a hypothesis. Now, hypotheses don't mean that they're merely subjective. There is evidence to support the hypothesis, but it's not definitive or conclusive. For our purposes, it's simply a way of thinking more broadly about the text of Mark and its relationship with its siblings in the New Testament and so on. And it is true, as Mary points out, that there are other Gospels out there that are not in the canon. They are extra or non-canonical texts. They are important for historical purposes, but they're not part of the foundational structure of Christianity as such. Now, there are some people who study them who think they are closer to the church than, and I wouldn't dispute that. Now, what this means, if you think about this, is that these synoptic gospels can be structured differently in terms of just layout. When you and I read Mark or Matthew or Luke or any John, we're going to read them vertically. We read Mark chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 16, verse 8. We read it sequentially. But that, to a significant extent, is because of the way our Bibles are laid out. You can read them horizontally. And if you had a gospel synopsis, it would look something like this. You can read them comparatively or horizontally. This one is, what is it? It doesn't seem to show up here. Yeah, it is Jesus in the temptation in the desert. You can see how Matthew describes it in chapter 4, Mark in chapter 1, and Luke in chapter 4. You can read them comparatively. Or go down and look at this. And now what do you see? Jesus preaching of repentance. Aha, Mark doesn't have anything. So that fits in with what I've been trying to describe earlier about additional material in Matthew and Luke. Again, some of us are interested in these historical peculiarities and particularities. Others of you are not. That's okay. That's okay. But it does change your perspective a little bit when we get into the text of Mark, I think. And so we know what we're reading and maybe what we're not reading. I remember this. Maybe others have had the same experience. It all seemed a little rote and crazy at the time, but when I started seminary and was taking a first class on the Gospels, we had our Greek synopsis. It was structured kind of like this or this, and it was in Greek. And we were told to go get a set of colored pencils, and we had a key, and we were to write different color in different colors based on this key in terms of how the three Gospels were similar or different and in what ways. Now, it sounds like a tedious task, and it was in many ways, but you were clued in to the differences, similarities between the three Gospels as you read them horizontally, comparatively. Okay. I come back, when you put all that together, to the outline that you can see here and you can find on the webpage from Sandra Hubenthal. I'm not going to go on any further here, but you can see that very easily. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to go to, I guess I'm going to get out of this and go back to the description of this course and look at the paragraph that I think you've read before, but I'd like to just sort of explain and describe it a little bit. Mark's gospel presents its theology in narrative form, where the actions and words of Jesus challenge readers and hearers with a powerful vision of God's reign, or, to be literal in your translation, God's kingdom. Okay, I'm not going to ask historical questions so much, normally, of did Jesus do or did he actually historically say this? That's just put to the side in my conversation with Mark. I'm interested in the way Mark tells the story, a powerful story. And literary people, and I think they're right, and maybe journalists too, love to tell us that people resonate to stories. We as human beings resonate to stories. Sometimes we tell our own stories about ourselves and our life autobiographically. Sometimes we read fictional stories, novels, etc. And when you think about a story, you approach the material somewhat differently. Who are the main characters? What's the plot? Is there a plot? What's the plot designed to tell us? And so on. You know, there's pace, there's geography in the story world. It's like going to the most gripping movie you've ever seen. When we could walk in, buy our ticket, walk in, pick up our ticket, whatever, sit down, and that story is constructed before our very eyes and in our ears. And if it's really gripping, we walk out, we leave that story world and enter the real world again. Or think about the best novel you've ever read. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I'm really disappointed when I finish and I have to leave that story world for good, unless I go back and read it again or just think about it. Now, that's the way I want to converse with Mark in our time together in these 4 weeks. I think the Markan vision of the kingdom of God is expansive and it's inclusive. It's an expansive and it's an expansive and inclusive theological vision of God's kingdom that the writer of Mark brings to life. As the journey of discipleship unfolds, the narrative world of in the narrative world of Mark, it becomes clear that the destination of this journey is the cross. And along the way, the disciples, and by implication, the contemporary followers of Christ, learn that in this kingdom, things are turned upside down. The first are last. The sinners and the dishonored are invited to the table of fellowship, and those closest to Jesus are often filled with fear rather than faith. That's the best I can do to give you a kind of synopsis in a handful of lines of the narrative that Mark presents to us in his gospel. Now, I'll be a little autobiographical here in my own journey on the Gospel of Mark. And I will just tell you a little bit about my background in terms of thinking about this. When I first started when I first started studying the New Testament Gospels seriously, I very naively thought Mark's Gospel was not only a primitive text in terms of language and style, but also rather unsophisticated literarily and theologically. I had a hard time kind of coming to terms with this text that was, in my view at that point, just plain primitive. Now, about the same time as that, I was being exposed to feminist readings of Mark's Gospel, or narrative readings of Mark's Gospel. And as I pursued this, it became very, very quickly obvious to me that my naive thinking about Mark's Gospel was sorely inadequate. And my journey led me to a view that turned almost 180 degrees opposite. If anything, Mark's Gospel for many people is simply too hot to handle because the Gospel's claims about the reign of God and what it means to follow Jesus to the cross are intense and they are unrelenting. As I've said in the synopsis, in the story world of Mark's Gospel, the disciples are anything but stalwarts in the faith. They often exhibit misunderstanding and fear. And what appears to be the original ending of Mark's Gospel leaves the reader hanging out there. We'll talk more specifically about this in the last session. There is Jesus in the empty tomb, but in Mark's Gospel, there are no appearances of Jesus in what we consider to be the original ending. So we are left hanging. What happens? I'll give you some ideas about what I think that might mean later on. But you see, this really quite sophisticated story, narrative, challenges us with a view of the reign of God and the kingdom of God that is not only in terms of words, but as we will see, is a matter of following the journey with Christ to the cross. Now, we have a problem here. If we are not careful, the lectionary cycle of texts and the practicing preacher can effectively disassemble the Gospel of Mark. Not necessarily by intention, but effectively disassemble the narrative and make the Markan story of Jesus almost unrecognizable and certainly lose its cutting edge. When congregants, in the pew or virtually, hear only disconnected snippets of the Markan text spread over the Sundays of the church year, it is perhaps inevitable, it seems to me, that a clear sense of the narrative will be lost. It is analogous, I would say, to having someone read a novel to you 5 pages a week over the course of a full year. Needless to say, it would be easy to lose the power of the story. Are you able? I don't know what happened there, but
rooms are closing in 40 seconds.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as an introduction to next time. And I think My argument is going to be that in the church, we have to deal with the Gospels in at least two ways, one liturgically and one narratively. And try to do this so that we just don't break up all of the integrity of the narrative and recontextualize it in the liturgy.